Hi, this is Keith Much with United FM Radio, and we're also cross-posting on WFPN page, Facebook page. This is a Facebook exclusive. We're on Facebook only, and we have with us Roy Bork, who's the author of 2 books now.
The second one is in the publisher's hands.
It's on its way out, and we have some subjects to talk about today. The primary one is life after death, and you've written the second book. It goes deep into it, correct?
Yes, we're talking. It's a religious subject, going back to ancient times. They believed that life continued after death. There were different ideas of what that was, but it was a common belief. Many people today still have that belief. There are others that don't have that belief. So the question is, how do we know that life goes on?
Right.
And there are several ways. One of the ways is testimonies of those who have returned from being absent from the body. There's two classifications: near-death experience and out-of-body experience. They're very similar, except near-death experience occurs when the body is in an unconscious state, near death, and an out-of-body experience occurs when an individual is awake and conscious of the situation.
So there's multiple stages.
It happens at different times, and near-death experience is one, out-of-body experience is another, and they probably go by the same mechanism, but they occur with different mental states.
Right. So, in the subjects that we have here, we have how do we know that life goes on? And the first subject here is testimonies of those who have returned from being absent from the body. As in NDE, OBE. Can you explain what NDE or OBE is? Out-of-body experience and near-death experience.
A near-death experience occurs when an individual is usually in the hospital or maybe after an accident. Their life is right on the brink of dying. They are unconscious at the time. They are brought back. And then they have this experience that they had while they were comatose or unconscious of being out of the body.
Right.
Many of them will say, I saw myself lying there. In other words, they're looking at themselves from outside of they're not seeing with their physical eyes. So the question is that possible, and how?
Well, there's been a lot of accounts where people have been unconscious on the operating room table during a traumatic incident, and have explained things that are in the room, the doctors that were working on them, people think things that were being said. Is that not true?
That is correct.
So.
But there's different, many people, some believe. The believers say, yeah, I believe in that. The non-believers say, well, that's something that happens to the brain when you're going through a near-death operation, that the brain has these different upsets or hiccups. There's 2 books on the subject that I'd like to bring up. One of them was called Proof of Heaven, written by Eben Alexander. Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon. At the time, prior to his near-death experience, he did believe that near-death experience was something that happens to the brain when it is in an unconscious state. Something happens, you have this experience, you come back, and it can be explained by the fact that the brain was going through some kind of a hiccup.
Right.
He had spinal meningitis. They say that if you have spinal meningitis and you don't come out of it within 3 days, you're liable to have brain injury, brain damage. Ibn Alexander was in a comatose condition for 7 days with spinal meningitis. According to doctors' testimonies, he shouldn't have survived. Not only did he survive without any ill effects whatsoever.
Right.
So basically, he beat the odds, what they might call a medical miracle, except science doesn't regard the word miracle. It just says some kind of a spontaneous resolution. But he had an extraordinary near-death experience. And being a neurosurgeon, he had a pretty good scientific background of things. He could not find a scientific explanation of what happened to him.
Now, as in scientific, you mean like, for example, a lot of people say that this out-of-body experience is simply a massive release of chemicals into the brain. I forget the name of one of them, MDT or something.
I'm not familiar with the chemicals.
There's a chemical that's released into the brain that causes people to experience all these visions and all these experiences that they go through, the out-of-body experience. Everything that they see and experience is apparently a chemical reaction in the brain that occurs at death or near death.
And Ibn Alexander would have been fully aware of this. But his experience, he couldn't explain it by that method. He had envisioned things in his near death that he had never been exposed to in living while he was alive. So it's not like he's recalling things. He had access to information that he had never been exposed to while he was alive. And he could not explain that. Not only that, he couldn't explain why he was even here. By all intents and purposes, if he survived after 7 days, he should have been a vegetable.
Right.
And yet he survived with no ill effects whatsoever with this extraordinary experience.
And this is where the word miracle was used.
Well, that's where science doesn't like the word miracle. So
Right.
they kind of pass it off. Now, another one, Heaven is for Real by Todd Burpo. He had a 4-year-old son who had an appendectomy. And after this appendectomy, Todd Burpo, being a minister, was talking to his son, things about, were you scared or whatever. And his son started relating experiences he had while he was on the operating table.
Wow.
He says, that's where the angel sang to me. And so his father perked up and said, what do you mean? Well, he didn't know how to explain that. He just said, the angel sang to me. And over time, he started relating these experiences that he had that as a 4-year-old he wouldn't have known on his own. These weren't things that a 4-year-old would have been told. These aren't things that a 4-year-old would have been exposed to. One in particular, he was talking to his mother one day, and he said, I have a sister. And she says, yeah, I know you have a sister.
Right.
And he says, no, I have another sister. And she says, what do you mean you have another sister? He says, I met her on the other side.
Oh, yeah, you were telling me about this earlier.
Yeah, and she's looking at him, and she's, well, what was her name? And he says, she didn't have a name. You hadn't named her. She died in your tummy. Well, how does a 4-year-old know that his mother had a miscarriage? And yet that's what he's describing. And the mother was floored. But being a minister, the minister doesn't know how to approach the church with this. And that's because the church has their own preconceived ideas about what life after death and judgment and all that is supposed to be. Their idea and the church...
It's almost like it seems like a lot of these churches use fear-mongering tactics to get people to do the church's will, almost, to believe exactly what the church is preaching. If you don't do this or that, you're gonna go to hell, and we're all gonna judge you, and that's that.
Well,
What do you say about that?
Well, that is a part of it. One of the things, let me give you an idea. I was in industrial training sessions, and the first thing they teach you is what can go wrong. So they talk about, what happens if you do this or what happens if you do that. And when the church talks about Judgment Day, essentially what they're saying, if you want to live a good life, there's certain things you mustn't do.
Right.
So they use this fear tactic to try to get you to buy into, hey, there's 10 commandments and you need to follow them. I don't know that their intention is to scare the bejesus out of you, but sometimes that's what they do.
Jim says that one of the best books in our journey home by Jason McLeod. You ever hear of him? McLeod?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Well, he's actually been on the station here and interviewed. If you're out there listening, if you want to ask Roy a question or if you want to input something, studio number is on the screen, 860-626-5193, 860-626-5193, and you can talk to Roy, ask him a question, input your thoughts in, whatever you feel like doing. Lines are open, and we'll patch you right through. So Roy here.
Okay, so let's continue this. Around turn of the century, last century, there was a clairvoyant by the name of Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce had a pretty interesting testimony. As a boy, he was having trouble with some lessons. His father was questioning him about this book, and he didn't seem to have the information. So his father said, well, okay, let's take a break, and we'll come back to this, and we'll see if we can get you to learn this. Well, Edgar Cayce put his head down on the book and took a nap. And to his surprise, when he woke up, it was like the entire book was in his mind.
Wow.
He didn't know how that happened. His father was sort of flabbergasted with him afterwards and actually upset with him, that you knew this and you're giving me all this hard time. And Edgar Cayce says, I don't understand it. Well, Edgar Cayce was under the impression that certain things you don't do, sometimes they call it the work of the devil or black magic. So he was basically told, you got to suppress whatever this thing is.
What, the black magic?
Whatever it was that he was sensing, this ability, they were saying, well, that has to be from some dark side.
Right.
But over time, Edgar Cayce started talking with different people, and they said it's not the tool, it's how you use it.
Right.
So Edgar Cayce developed this ability, and he became a clairvoyant in which he could go into a trance. And while he was in this trance, he would access what he called a hall of records. Now, he called it the Akashic Records. I don't know if that was his term or whether that was a standard term at the time. But he said this hall of records was the memory of the universe. And it contained a record of every person that ever lived, everything they ever did, and the intentions of why they did it. And he would get the keeper of the records, and the keeper of the records would give him a copy of that information that he needed to help a certain soul along its journey. This Akashic Records, he equated to the Book of Revelation's Book of Life.
Right.
He says, I've seen it. It's there. I've witnessed it.
Did he actually, pull someone's record and say, you thought this and you did this and you did that?
He was aware that that was contained in the records, but the keeper of the records would only give him access to information that would help the soul in its present issue. So in many times, it was usually a medical problem.
Right.
And the thing that made it so unique was that in the medical records or in the Akashic records, he was giving information. There was a woman who was bit by a brown recluse spider.
Right.
She didn't know why she had a skin lesion. She only knew that it wouldn't clear up. And so Edgar Cayce came back from his trance and he said, you need to speak to this doctor, get this certain salve, put it on the lesion, and it will draw out the poison. Well, the doctor said we used to have that salve around here, but I haven't seen it for a while. I don't know where to get it. So on a subsequent trance, Edgar Casey said, if you go into your cabinet on the third shelf behind a certain bottle, you will find an old bottle of this salve. Well, Edgar Casey had never been in this doctor's office. He wouldn't know it was there by having been there. So the doctor goes in his cabinet, looks behind that bottle, and sure enough, there it is. And so that gave some credence to what Edgar Casey was saying.
Right.
Now, because of all of these testimonies, this went on for years. And all of his recordings were all written down by his wife. They are all entered into the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Many of those records are now being used to try to do studies on medical research to find out what is there. But it's just the idea that these records were there and somebody was able to contact them.
Do you think that sometimes when people have these conversations about these subjects that they use the word enlightenment as a secondary word or a misconceived word as entertainment? Do you ever have...
Some might.
Because when you say we're going to talk about these subjects and enlighten you on things, some people are like, oh, enlighten, oh, that's entertain. They're entertaining us. They're not actually being serious about the subject they're talking about.
Well,
So,
it can actually work both ways. Do you know what the word enlightenment actually means?
tell us, what is it? What is it? I think it needs to educate you on something that you've never been able to conceive, that's outside your understanding.
In Eastern philosophy, the term light and dark has to do with knowledge and ignorance. Light means knowledge, dark means ignorance. So when you talk about enlightening, it means to bring information to the forefront that helps people to understand. And that is what enlightenment is all about.
Right.
So when you go to school and learn about chemistry, you are being enlightened about molecular combinations.
Jim says enlighten means to educate.
Yes, essentially what it is. It's to bring knowledge to the forefront. It is to educate.
So that's technically what we're doing right now, is we're educating people on the subject. And it not entertaining.
Well, it is, to some people it is entertaining because it's new knowledge to some, and it's like watching a TV program, a documentary. That can be considered entertaining, but at the same token, it can be, hey, this is new information that we need to look at.
Now, this other subject here, those who have witnessed... Oh, no, I'm sorry. Understanding the quantum... I'm sorry. An understanding of the quantum world matrix. What? You talking about Matrix? Like, Neo?
Well, I had an out-of-body experience. I was 9 years old at the time. I was meditating on God. And what I saw was that everything in nature was reducible to a common denominator. I didn't really know what the common denominator was, but I knew it had something to do with creation and the Creator. When I went to a nuclear physics class, the instructor said something. He said every neutron in the universe is the same. Every electron in the universe is the same. Every proton in the universe is the same. And these three particles essentially make up everything else. Well, no sooner had he said that, I realized there was a common denominator. And one of the questions that comes to mind is, how did I know that 11 years earlier? They weren't teaching quantum mechanics in third grade, and yet that is the knowledge that I needed to know in order to have that experience.
Right.
Now, when I say quantum world matrix, nobody can explain why every electron in the universe is the same. But throughout, well, my concept, let me digress here. My concept of God is that God is the life force of the cosmos. It establishes the matrix of the quantum world, which in turn generates the natural forces. And from those comes everything else. Now, this matrix fills the universe. And quantum mechanics is starting to understand what this matrix is all about.
So you're saying that science is starting to mingle with spirituality?
It's starting to, because
the spirit world, you're saying that the spirit world has a connection with science?
currently there are only people dabbling in the idea, because when you talk spirit world, you're talking a dimension that we're not familiar with. I mean, as soon as you say out-of-body experience, science world has no way of quantifying that.
Right.
So they try to come up with, well, you know, your brain did this or your brain did that. But it's like, how did I get out of my body? And how does science explain that? Now, according to religion, you have a soul. According to Eastern philosophy, the body has a physical body. The physical body is the hardware of your existence. You have an astral body. The astral body is your software of your existence, and it's actually separate from your physical body. In an out-of-body or near-death experience, it is the astral body that leaves the physical body. Now, Eastern philosophy claims that it is connected to the physical body by what is known as the astral cord. And this information goes back to ancient times. Ancient Egypt was aware of it.
Right.
They understood it. They believed it. It was all part of their belief system. When I looked at the book of Exodus, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and not only does he have 10 commandments, but he has information on how to construct the tabernacle. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it tell you why that construction was made. But when I studied astral projection, I found why that was made that way. And what it turns out, there were 4 coverings. There was the outermost covering made out of badger skins, which represented the physical body. There was an undermost covering underneath that, which is made out of less coarse material. It was ram skins dyed red. It represented the astral body. Underneath that was spun goat's hair, which represented what is called the mental body, or the energies that go between the astral and the physical. And then beneath that was the fine linen, which represented the spiritual body. Now, spiritual body is what connects your astral body to what is known in Eastern philosophy as the absolute, which is all knowledge. People who have had out-of-body experiences says they seem to be aware of things that they were not aware of in living life. They don't know where the information came from. It's almost instantaneous. And when you come back from an out-of-body experience, you're left with this longing, like, I saw the answer to everything, and now I only have bits and pieces.
And I felt great.
Oh yeah, I mean,
when you cross over, there's a ultimate sensation of bliss and free. You feel free. You feel you're not tied to your body anymore. You're this ball of energy that's just you're there. You're there. You're not physically there, but you're there. And the sensation is incredible. It's outstanding.
Now, Keith, you told me you had a near-death experience.
Yep.
Can you describe to me what your physical body, or what your body looked like when you gazed at it?
It was just light energy.
It was light energy, and it had no physical...
It was changing different colors, not like more like a soft, glowing... Casper, it was incredible, and you don't feel. All you feel is energy. You don't feel your body. You feel free, disconnected from the physical world. It's a awesome experience. And when you come back, you're like, what the hell?
And you said that you saw things and heard things that were otherworldly and beyond your wildest imaginations.
Yeah. Communication happened. Like this conversation could happen in a split second.
According to Eastern philosophy, enlightenment, inspiration all come from this spiritual body. When your body or when your mind is tuned in to what the Eastern philosophy calls the absolute. And the absolute is actually what we call the matrix. So when we're looking at quantum mechanics, this matrix fills the universe, and it governs the laws, the processes, the structures, and the properties of everything that exists.
Right.
And when you're in tune with that, this is where these ideas, what Plato called the world of ideas, comes from, is that anything is possible once you cross that boundary. That's why a lot of people are anxious to go there, because they realize that enlightenment, it opens your mind to these things. So when I studied nuclear physics, I didn't have to question in my mind, is this true or is this not true? It's like I intuitively knew, yeah, I've been there. So I don't have a problem accepting it. It's just a question of what more can we learn about it.
Now, what are those that have witnessed spirits of parting souls? What does that mean?
Well, I had a friend that I was talking about this out-of-body experience. And he says, I never told this to anybody before, but now that we're on the subject, I feel that this is maybe the first time that I can actually talk about it.
Right.
He says, I woke up one morning, it was about 6 o'clock in the morning, and he says, my father's, what I would call spirit, was standing at the foot of my bed. And he said, I didn't know what to make of it. And my father looked at me and is sort of like, I'm saying goodbye, and I want you to know that everything is going to be all right. And then that spirit was gone. Well, about 7 o'clock, the phone rang. And he says, it was my family. And they said, we're calling to let you know that Dad just passed away. And he said,
oh, wow.
And he said, when did that happen? He says, about an hour ago. So he says, they're saying that when I saw his spirit was the very time in which he was he had passed away.
Right.
I've talked to different people that have similar experiences where they see the spirit of a loved one after they passed away, sort of trying to give them a sense, hey, everything is going to be all right, but I have to leave you. And I've had different people tell me that. Now, another thing, talking about life after life, is my wife was telling me that her brother, when he was just starting to talk, started talking about what happened to him when he was in the war. Now, we're talking a 3-year-old.
Children who remember having lived a former life? Is that what you're going into?
Yes. My wife said, we didn't have a TV back then. Nobody talked to my brother about wartime episodes. And yet he's talking, just learn to talk is communicating what happened to him while he was in the war. Well, how would he know that? I mean, how do you imagine, how do you make that up when you've never been exposed to any of the information?
Right.
Now, I had a coworker. She told me that when her daughter first started to talk, she tried to explain what happened to her when she was big. And she says a lot of families are taught, you suppress that. You say, well, you don't talk about that. That's just your imagination. But
right.
This particular coworker, she says, I was open to it. So I encouraged her. What happened to you when you were big? And she talked about this accident she had been, and that's why she died.
Right.
And now she's a 3-year-old explaining this to her mother. I mean, what 3-year-old is even aware of death? I didn't know.
Not too many.
I did not know that death existed until I started going to church, and they talked about it, that one day you will die. A 3-year-old doesn't know what death is, and yet she's describing her death in a former life.
Right.
Now, this is it's very intriguing. Where does this information come from? So to me, it tells me that there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot of testimonies of information that we can glean upon that says this isn't all there is to life. I mean, you can't convince me because I've been outside of this body.
Right.
Anybody that's had a near-death experience says, I don't believe what I used to believe. I do believe that this body is just a vessel that I get to operate while I'm in it. But one day I'm not going to be in it anymore, and when our bodies are old and decrepit, we discard them just like we do an old car.
Right.
And we don't grieve over the old car, we go out and get a new one.
Yep.
And when you get into Eastern philosophy, it really gets into that. It really talks about life on the other side. It talks about the astral plane. It talks about the spiritual growth that one goes through. And this isn't what our religions are teaching us today. But yet I find that Eastern philosophy is the roots of a lot of our religions. For instance, the Tabernacle of Israel. Eastern philosophy helped me to understand it. And so there was a lot that I learned in Eastern philosophy that helped me to understand what they were trying to tell me in church. But now I have a better explanation for it.
Right.
And so that's basically the premise of the second book. It's called We Believe, or A Journey into Christ Consciousness. And it is a little bit about not so much what the Bible says, but why does it say it? Where did this information come from? What is it based on? Because once you know what it's based on, then you can start tying it into other things, like the modern quantum world. It's not two separate things. I was reading a book on Eastern philosophy today, and it said that to the wisdom yoga, nature and God mean the same thing.
Right.
They're two different ways of seeing it. Now, when I took a psychology course, I had learned about that the brain is actually made up of two hemispheres. Each hemisphere thinks differently. It's called the split brain concept. And when I learned what each hemisphere, the kinds of things that are there, that's when I started to realize the scientific world, the scientific method, is all left brain oriented subjects. But when I looked at religion, I realized that comes from the right brain. It's artistic expressions. It's mysticism. It's
when you say left and right brain, you're saying that a lot of people realize there's two hemispheres in the brain, the left and the right, and they control different motor functions, your vision, and thought patterns.
Yes.
So that's what you're talking about, left and right brain. I just wanted to clarify that.
But the fact that each one thinks differently, what I realized is that there were two different ways of seeing the world, and that each one was right in its own way. But you couldn't directly correlate one to the other, because one uses artistic expressions and the other one uses mathematical models. But when you compare the details, they're the same thing.
Right. So, going on here, we talk about the Ka in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Now, when we talk about the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the only thing that comes to mind is the movie The Mummy.
Yeah,
they were trying to bring the guy. Is there actually an Egyptian Book of the Dead?
Yes. It's the hieroglyphics that were found in the pyramid text.
Right.
Some of them were in papyri text, and some of them were the hieroglyphs that were carved into the stone.
So what is the Ka of the Egyptian Book of the Dead?
It's pronounced Ka. And
Ka.
The Ka of the Egyptian Book of the Dead is the astral body of Eastern philosophy. They're the same thing, just two different words describing the same thing. So when we talk about the physical body and the astral body, the Egyptians were right on board with that. And a lot of that's where it comes from. It goes back to the Egyptian period.
Now, the Egyptians didn't believe, from what I'm watching Hollywood too much, but the Egyptians don't believe in a hell and heaven. They have something called the underworld.
The underworld
it's a unified spiritual realm where everything that dies goes to.
Well, here's an interesting thing. You know where the term underworld comes from?
No.
All right. Back in the day, they used to believe that the sun revolved around the earth.
Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
And every night it went under the world.
Yep.
And it got dark.
Yeah, that's what they used to believe in.
Well, here's the whole point. What happens when it gets dark? There's a lot of people who are afraid of the dark. And I'll tell you, I was one of them when I was a child.
No, your imagination runs wild when there's no light present. So the mind runs free and wild, and you can dream up and imagine all kinds of things roaming around in the dark.
And so in the Egyptian underworld, that was the abode of the dead. That is where your spirit went when you left your body. It went to the underworld. And they had all kinds of incantations about how to navigate the underworld. But one of the things you'll find in the underworld, there was a lake of fire.
Oh, yeah, yep.
And actually, that's where some of the ideas of hellfire originate, is in the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
So how does the Egyptian Book of the Dead and what the Egyptians believe in have anything to do with today?
A lot of what religion believes is based on what they believed then, because Eastern philosophy very much tied into the Egyptian beliefs.
Right.
So a lot of the Egyptian beliefs carried over into modern religions. The trick of modern religions is to weed out fact from fiction. And that's one of the difficulties that they've had throughout the centuries. For how long was the Earth the center of the universe? And how many different religious developments based on that? The hierarchy of the Earth being the center, and then you had all of these planetary spheres and the spheres of the stars and all this. Aristotle's crystal spheres was all part of that Earth center of the universe. So you find that many modern beliefs have their roots in ancient belief, and the question is to weed out what is true, what isn't true. And what I find is that when you take modern science and you start using that to understand the teachings of Eastern philosophy, there is a point in which you can start blending them together and say, well, if you see it this way, it fits right in.
Right.
And that's how I was able to weed out fact from fiction, is that if I can quantify it scientifically, then I can support it.
Right.
If I can't quantify it scientifically, of course, one of the problems is when you're talking about spirit versus physical. The physical world is made up of matter. The spirit world is intangible.
Yep.
So now you're talking about psychology, sociology. You're going into places where you're dealing with the inner workings of the mind. And a lot of religion, that's really what it's about. It's about the inner workings of the mind, the thought process processes of the human psyche.
Now, moving on here on the final topic, the fourfold covering of the Hebrew tabernacle.
Well, that's what I mentioned earlier about the badger skins, and then you have the ram skins dyed red, and then you have the spun goat's hair, and then you have the fine linen. And those were the four coverings of the human body, starting with the physical matter of our outermost covering, and then the astral body, then the mental body, then the spiritual body. And then beyond that, underneath all these coverings, you had a veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And then the Holy of Holies is where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is supposedly the place where God dwelt.
Right.
In Eastern philosophy, that would be where the knowledge of God is found. So, in other words, the place of enlightenment is in that Ark of the Covenant. All knowledge is represented by that. The veil represented the separation between man's understanding and what Eastern philosophy calls the absolute, or absolute knowledge.
Right.
So here you are looking at a Jewish symbol that can easily be interpreted from Eastern philosophical teachings, and it fits. And now it's there for a reason, and it all has meaning.
And all of this is, everything that we've discussed is going to be in the second book.
Yes.
And what is the name of the book again?
It's called We Believe. It's going to be published by Dorrance Publishing. Right now it's at the publisher. I'm waiting for all the paperwork to go through. But
now the book you have out now is called The Merging of Two Worlds by Roy E. Bork.
Yes, The Merging of Two Worlds was when I first looked at the idea that there were two ways of seeing the world. So I tried to take religious ideas and scientific ideas and put them together. And that is the two worlds merging. But you have to weed out the misconceptions in order to see where the connections are. Otherwise, they don't match.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that concludes today's show. Is there anything else you want to finish off with? Or a message, or I'll be back?
We'll be back, but I've opened a door that is closed for many people. It's one of those subjects where, well, I just watched a show on TV. It was called The Song of Bernadette. And in the beginning and also at the end, there was a statement, and I want to quote it here. It said, "To the believers, no explanation is necessary. And to those who don't believe, no explanation is possible." So there's going to be people who are going to say, I'd like to look into this more, and there's other people going to be, what a bunch of crap I just heard. And so, I understand that there's going to be two different ways, or maybe even three different ways of looking at this. There's going to be those that say, I believe. There's going to be those that say, I don't believe. And there's going to be those that say, well, I'm not sure. But I'm hoping that I at least got somebody's attention that says, when a loved one dies, they're not just gone.
Right.
They're moving on. It's part of their spiritual development. And even being here, part of our spiritual development. We learn things. And how does a person come into the world like Einstein, knowing what he knew, if we're born with a blank slate? I mean, it's obvious.
Good question.
Yeah, so I mean, those are the things that people need to think about. And one of the problems with religion is a lot of people don't want to think about it. But I'm the type of person that thinks if you don't think about it, you'll never get beyond the point of, well, is it true or not? Once you start thinking about it and start going into the depth of it, now you're starting to pull out some facts and figures and basis that says, okay, this is based on something, and now I can put some kind of a name to it. So that's what I'm hoping, is that people will take this information and say, okay, this is the beginning of maybe a new chapter in my life.
Well, awesome. And you definitely went into an awesome description of some of the questions I asked and the topics here. And hopefully we'll have you back and we'll have more topics and get deeper into your second book.
Well, there's a lot of other things to be covered, so this is a start. So we'll see where it goes from there.
All right, folks, that's it for now. This is Keith Much with Roy Bork, the author of 2 books, The Merging of Two Worlds. And the second book is called
We Believe.
And it's not out yet.
It's not out yet.
And when do you plan on having this published?
Well, I'm hoping late this summer.
Well, we'll definitely be getting the information out about that book when you do publish it. We'll put links up on the site and get people to check it out. All right, that's it for now.
There is one thing.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a website. If you look up The Merging of Two Worlds, it'll take you there. And also the name of the website is scienceandreligionconverging.com. And it will give you full description of what The Merging of Two Worlds is all about.
All right, very good. All right, that's it for now. We'll be back in a couple of weeks or so. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. So, Keith Much, Roy Bork, United FM Radio, WFPN Radio in Norwich, Connecticut. We're simulcasting on. We'd like to thank WFPN for sharing our feed here, and we'll be back. This is United FM Radio, WFPN Radio, Norwich, Connecticut. Good day, everybody.
Good night.